Before the giant nuclear accident at Chernobyl in Ukraine in 1986, the biggest accident before Chernobyl involving a commercial nuclear reactor was the one at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. That nuclear meltdown happened in March of 1979.
Good evening. In a nuclear power plant near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the cooling system broke down this morning. Some radioactive steam escaped into the air. Radiation passed through the 4-foot concrete walls and was detected a mile away from the plant.
It was shortly after 4 this morning at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant when a valve in a water pump that cools the number 2 reactor blew out. The blowout triggered an automatic shutdown of the system, but before the plant was sealed, some radioactive steam escaped into the air.
Harrisburg Hospital, in case it has to move out, has cut its patient load to 50% by limiting admissions to emergencies. Sue Moses' baby, Joseph, was born at the hospital the day of the plant accident. She'll take the baby home tomorrow, but Mrs. Moses is still thinking of leaving.
I would just as soon be a little bit further away from the activity that is going on right here.
Imagine having your baby right there in the middle of the 3 Mile Island meltdown. The meltdown at 3 Mile Island happened at 4 in the morning on March 28, 1979. That was a Wednesday. They evacuated pregnant women and preschool-aged kids within 5 miles of the plant. By 2 days after the accident, by Friday of that week, they'd extended the evacuation zone to a 20-mile radius around the plant. More than 100,000 people were evacuated around 3 Mile Island. By that weekend, President Jimmy Carter was on the scene, wearing funny booties and touring the plant and trying to show that the situation was being brought under control. Ultimately, the cleanup at 3 Mile Island took nearly 15 years and $1 billion. But the scariest thing about that accident right when it happened was that nobody really knew how bad it was or how bad it was going to get or what it even meant in terms of dangerousness to have a large-scale nuclear accident in this country. So that nuclear meltdown happened. The 3 Mile Island crisis started at the very end of March 1979. What was going on in Washington at the very end of March 79? March 1979 in Washington, while 3 Mile Island is fixating the country. In Washington, they were having a huge debt ceiling fight. The president was a Democrat, Jimmy Carter. The Senate was controlled by the Democrats. Robert Byrd was the leader in the Senate. The House was controlled by Democrats, too. Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House. But even though Democrats had control of the White House and both houses of Congress, the Republicans in the House had figured out a way to attach to the debt ceiling an amendment to the United States Constitution. They wanted to attach a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution and make raising the debt ceiling contingent on passing that constitutional amendment. So even though the Republicans were in the minority, they had figured out how to do this. And they were convinced that this was a genius strategy and that it would not only work, it would make the Democrats look terrible in the process. The top Republican in the House at the time was Congressman John Rhodes of Arizona, and he told the New York Times when all this was happening, quote, "I think the Democrats fear a balanced budget like the devil fears holy water." So while 3 Mile Island melted down in Pennsylvania, in Washington, in Congress, they fought and fought and fought and fought and fought right up until the deadline. 3 Mile Island melted down on a Wednesday. The debt ceiling deadline was the following Tuesday. Congress waited until the day before the debt ceiling deadline to finally raise the debt ceiling. And no, the Republicans did not get their balanced budget amendment. They got some sort of meaningless symbolic promises in that direction. But they did ultimately raise the debt ceiling. Turns out, though, they did not raise it fast enough. They got too close. The fact that they waited until the very last minute had really big consequences. And I think part of the reason that this has been sort of lost to history is that nobody was paying attention to it at the time that it happened, because there was something else to pay attention to. There was a legit nuclear meltdown, a non-metaphorical nuclear meltdown on U.S. soil at the same time. So this is what everybody was talking about and paying attention to at the time. But looking back at it now, from this distance, we can see that what Congress was doing while the country was freaking out about that nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania ends up being sort of an important lesson, an important almost dry run in why screwing with the debt ceiling is a really bad idea. There's only a couple of examples of screwing with the debt ceiling in modern history. There's 2011, of course. House Republicans under John Boehner did force us in 2011 to get very, very close to the debt ceiling. There was no actual default in 2011. We did end up paying all of our bills. But because we got so close to the debt ceiling that year, we did get our credit rating downgraded as a nation for the first time in history. The Government Accountability Office crunched the numbers later and figured that just that, with no default, just getting close enough to have people smell default, that cost the government about $1.3 billion that it would not have otherwise had to spend. So that's one of the two modern experiences we've had with getting close to the debt ceiling, with this kind of drama. The other one was that one in 1979, and that one was actually worse, even though people don't much think about it, and it's not really a high-profile thing in our modern economic history. But in 1979, in the coincident with 3 Mile Island debt disaster, we did actually partially default on the debt. Congress acted the day before we got to the technical debt ceiling, and they thought they had taken care of it. They thought they had averted the crisis. But in getting so close, in getting within a day of the deadline, they actually got too close. And Treasury bonds that were due to be paid off on April 26th and on May 3rd and on May 10th, all of the bonds that came due on those days didn't get paid back on time. Sorry, glitch, we got too close, system overwhelmed, software couldn't handle it. We apparently didn't know how to use those newfangled computing machines at the time, and the Treasury was unable to make all of the payments it was supposed to make on all of the debt that we own. People who held those specific Treasury bonds did eventually get paid, but they got paid late. They got paid up to a week late. And those delayed payments do mean that we kind of sort of defaulted on that debt for a few days. And because of that, investors sued the United States of America, saying that the U.S. government had not paid what we said we were going to pay. They tried to make the government pay interest for the days when these investors should have had their money, but they didn't because the U.S. was deadbeat and wasn't paying when we said we would. Ultimately, that whole affair ended up hiking the interest rates. Sounds boring, but it ends up being really expensive. The Treasury had to pay higher interest rates on bonds that it wanted to issue thereafter, which means we got to pay people more money for the privilege of them lending us something. Interest rates got hiked by a little more than 0.5%. And it may not sound like much, but that hike in the interest rates didn't go back down when the crisis was averted. We'd proved ourselves to be untrustworthy, and so the hike in the interest rates stuck with us as a sort of penalty for having screwed up. And if you add up the cost of all the extra interest payments we had to make because of that screw-up, in the first decade alone, after that little technical just for a second glitchy default in 1979, we spent $12 billion that we would not have otherwise had to spend because we did that. So people saying they were so concerned about debt and deficits made us add $12 billion extra dollars to the debt for no purpose, for nothing in return. You would have been better off setting that cash on fire. At least then it could keep you warm. In this case, it was for nothing. So today we are 3 days away from the debt ceiling. We are due to hit it on Thursday. And aside from Fukushima, there's no ongoing nuclear meltdown to distract us from this one. The White House today announced that it was asking the top Democrat and the top Republican from both the House and the Senate to come personally to the White House to talk to President Obama and Vice President Biden face to face, just the 6 of them, to try to work this thing out once and for all. That was due to happen at 3 o'clock Eastern today, but at the very last minute, that meeting was scrapped. Senate Democrats and Republicans said that their own discussions were going well enough that they thought it would be worth putting off the White House meeting to see if they could get a little further on in their negotiations. As everybody waited all afternoon to see when that postponed meeting would happen at the White House, the Senate Republicans, very late in the day, announced that actually they wanted to sleep on it. Apparently not enough Republican senators were in Washington for them to convene for a meeting to discuss this stuff until tomorrow morning. So that means that the next potential meeting, the next opportunity for an act of furtherance toward saving ourselves from economic catastrophe can come no sooner than midday tomorrow after Senate Republicans meet at 11 a.m. Even if the Senate does work something out, of course, it will then have to go through the House, where there have been even fewer signs that progress is imminent, let alone possible. Markets today were relatively stable, if a bit nervous, as the markets hope just as much as everything else that something does get resolved. But even if Congress does serve something up tomorrow, we will then be within 2 days of hitting the debt ceiling. When we got within 1 day of hitting the debt ceiling back in 1979, we did real harm to the country. And yes, it was overshadowed only by a nuclear meltdown, but it did real, lasting, and expensive harm to the country. Hitting the debt ceiling would be bad. getting close to the debt ceiling is bad too. Are we close enough already to start worrying about the damage? Joining us now is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. He's a member of the Senate Budget Committee. Senator Whitehouse, thanks so much for being with us.
Very happy to be with you.
So, growing up, my dad always told me close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades.
This is the hand grenade version of that.
Oh, I was going to ask, does close also count in debt ceilings? Are we already in dangerous territory?
Yeah, it absolutely does. There are two consequences of a default from not raising the debt ceiling. One is if you actually don't do it, and then markets and interest rates adjust in probably unimaginably bad ways. But even when you get close, other countries, bankers, people buying Treasury securities look around and think, this security doesn't seem quite as secure as it used to. I think I'm going to have to charge a little bit more in order to come in and be a buyer. And because we pay the interest, that comes right out of the taxpayer's pocket. So it's very irresponsible to drive too close to the debt limit and to force all those costs on the taxpayers and to create all that uncertainty in the economic world.
What is your understanding of the status of discussions right now, both in the Senate and also overall towards some sort of resolution? One theory about why the markets are not freaking out too much already is that there's faith that a last-minute deal will be worked out. Is that your sense that that's true?
Well, you've heard the tone in the last day or so. Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell have had nothing but nice things to say about each other. There's been a constant spirit and tone of optimism. And now with the meeting scheduled for both caucuses tomorrow, I think it's logical to conclude that they have an agreement that they intend to present and that we'll then be voting on it tomorrow afternoon. And that leaves Speaker Boehner back where he was at the very beginning, which is it's his choice. Let them vote, and this is over or not.
If the House does what it did before, the last time it was in this situation, and John Boehner does not choose to bring up a measure that can pass for a vote, are you of the belief that President Obama could act unilaterally in some way, that there is any other option? Obviously, the White House and the president himself have been very clear that they don't want to do that. They think it would cause maybe even more problems than it might solve. What do you think about that as a constitutional matter?
It's whether or not there's a Article 2 or a 14th Amendment constitutional option that the president has, even if there is one, and just set that question aside for the sake of argument, even if there is one, him going to it sends that same signal to the markets and to the rest of the world that something really weird is going on in America, that this particular issue of American debt has a cloud over it, has a question mark around it, and that could have a very, very bad effect on markets and interest rates. And that, in turn, comes home to hit Americans in their pocketbooks.
Every time I have heard you talk about this issue, and whenever I have talked to you about other issues, you have always seemed to me like a pragmatic and grounded kind of senator. It's part of the reason that I wanted to talk to you about this. Because of that, and because you're on the Budget Committee, I have to ask you what it is like to try to negotiate and talk to your colleagues across the aisle about this when so many, it seems like increasing numbers of Republicans, even in the Senate, even senators who you think would have the experience to know better, are just saying this wouldn't be a big deal, wouldn't be catastrophic to hit the debt ceiling. They deny that it could really harm the country. How does that affect your work?
You just kind of have to take your breath in and say, my God, did he really just say that? What is he thinking? If you were to, I mean, the prevailing theory is, okay, so we don't allow the debt limit to go up, but there's still some money coming in and we can still pay off the Chinese with that and everything's going to be fine. Well, sure, except the fact that you have to sell treasuries out into a market. And the market is now looking around at a country that is maybe not sending out checks on time to Social Security recipients, maybe has gone into a much deeper government shutdown because there's no liquidity at all. I mean, the consequences, even if you're still paying the Chinese, are terrible. And investors aren't idiots. They can look across the table and see what else is happening. It's not just going to be the checks going to them. So it's like climate denial. It's really hard to reconcile it with reality.
Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, thank you very much for being with us tonight, sir. It's
Thank
good to have you
you.
here. Thank you. All right. Over the weekend, there was something that happened in Washington that, on the one hand, was kind of like, oh, I remember this, good old days. On the other hand, it was like, oh, I remember this, I thought we were past this now. It all came rushing back in a flood of stars and bars. That story's next.